After 25 years managing vendor contracts, the new CEO said I was too rigid and asked me, "Have you ever been shown the door after giving everything you had for 25 years?" Well, I have, and I pray it doesn't happen to anyone. Hi, I'm Daniel Ehrman, and for 25 years, I'd been the gatekeeper of vendor contracts at Meridian Industries. I started as a junior analyst fresh out of law school, back when contracts were still printed on paper and filed in actual cabinets. I'd watched the company grow from a mid-sized manufacturing firm to a Fortune 500 powerhouse, and every single vendor relationship, from the coffee supplier to our major technology partners, had crossed my desk. People called me meticulous. Some said obsessive. I preferred thorough. Every contract I touched had ironclad termination clauses, penalty structures that protected us from vendor failures, and escape hatches for changing business needs. I'd seen too many companies get burned by sloppy agreements, watched competitors hemorrhage money because someone forgot to include a force majeure clause or failed to specify liability limits. My office was a shrine to organization, contracts filed by date, vendor, and risk level. I maintained a master spreadsheet that tracked every renewal date, every automatic extension, every penalty trigger. The executives joked that I could recite contract terms in my sleep. They weren't wrong. I'd built Meridian's vendor management system from the ground up, and it had saved us millions over the years. But apparently being indispensable wasn't enough anymore. "Daniel, we need to talk." Bradley Kowalski, our new CEO, had been on the job for exactly 6 weeks. He'd come from a tech startup with big ideas about disrupting traditional business models and embracing agile partnerships. I should have seen it coming. His corner office still smelled like fresh paint and ambition. "The board wants to modernize our vendor relationships," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "More flexible terms, faster negotiations, less bureaucracy." "Flexible terms create risk," I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Our current contracts have protected us from opportunities," he interrupted. "Your rigid approach is holding us back. We want deals that can pivot quickly, partnerships that evolve with market conditions." I'd heard this speech before, from other executives who thought they could reinvent business fundamentals. "Mr. Kowalski, I've been managing vendor contracts for 25 years. The terms I negotiate aren't rigid, they're protective." His smile was patronizing. "That's exactly the problem, Daniel. You're stuck in the past. We want flexible deals, and frankly, you're not up for it." The words hung in the air like smoke. 25 years of expertise dismissed in a single sentence. I smiled back and stood up. "I understand completely." I walked to the door, then paused. "You might want to review the Henderson Tech contract before you make any changes. Section 12.3 is particularly important." He waved me off, already turning to his computer. "HR will handle the transition details." The first week of unemployment was strange. After 2.5 decades of 60-hour weeks, I found myself drinking coffee at 10 a.m. in my pajamas, wondering what to do with my time. I'd been offered a generous severance package, 6 months' salary plus benefits, which suggested they were either feeling guilty or nervous about something. My replacement was Jennifer Walsh, a contracts attorney from Bradley's previous company. She'd been brought in to streamline processes and reduce friction in vendor relationships. I'd met her briefly during the transition, bright, confident, eager to prove herself. She reminded me of myself at 30, minus the paranoia that comes from experience. I decided to take a real vacation for the first time in years. But old habits die hard, and I found myself checking industry news religiously. That's when I noticed the first red flag. Meridian had announced a new partnership with CloudVantage, a data analytics firm that promised to revolutionize decision-making through artificial intelligence. The press release was full of buzzwords about dynamic partnerships and innovative collaboration models. What it didn't mention were the liability protections that should have been in place for any company handling sensitive corporate data. Then I saw the Henderson Tech announcement. They were expanding their software integration services for Meridian, taking on additional responsibilities for customer data management. I remembered warning Bradley about Section 12.3, the clause that triggered massive penalty payments if Henderson failed to meet uptime requirements. Had Jennifer spotted that? Did she understand the implications? I told myself it wasn't my problem anymore, but 25 years of protecting a company doesn't just switch off overnight. The call came from Sarah Chen, my former assistant and the only person in the contracts department who'd kept in touch. We met at a coffee shop downtown, far from Meridian's offices. "It's chaos, Daniel," she said, stirring her latte nervously. "Jennifer's renegotiating everything. She says the old contracts were adversarial and that vendors should be true partners." "What does that mean in practice?" "She's removing penalty clauses, reducing liability protections, extending payment terms. The Henderson contract, she eliminated the uptime requirements entirely, said they were punitive and not aligned with modern partnership principles." I felt my chest tighten. "What about the CloudVantage deal?" Sarah's face went pale. "That's the worst one. No data breach protections, no performance guarantees, no termination rights for cause. She said trust is the foundation of innovation. Trust doesn't pay legal bills," I muttered. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The executives love her. Bradley's been telling everyone that vendor relationships have never been better. They're moving faster, closing deals in days instead of months, because she's giving everything away." "Daniel, what happens when this blows up?" I sipped my coffee, thinking. "Depends on how badly they screwed up the contracts. Could be anything, from embarrassing PR to bankruptcy-level lawsuits." Sarah leaned forward. "Would you consider coming back as a consultant? I could probably arrange—" "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. They made their choice. I'm too rigid, remember? But as I walked home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a slow-motion car crash, and despite everything, I still cared about the company I'd helped build. I started keeping a calendar, marking down contract renewal dates and milestone deadlines from memory. Not because I planned to intervene, but because I needed to know when the other shoe would drop. The first sign came 2 weeks later. A small item in the business section about CloudVantage experiencing a temporary service disruption. Without proper SLA protections, Meridian had no recourse for lost productivity or compensation for downtime. Then Henderson Tech missed a critical software update deadline. In the old contract, that would have triggered penalty payments and given Meridian the right to terminate. In Jennifer's version, it was just an unfortunate inconvenience. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt sick. The first lawsuit hit on a Thursday morning in October. CloudVantage had suffered a massive data breach exposing customer information for 17 of their clients, including Meridian. The affected customers were demanding compensation, and Meridian had no legal protection to pass the liability back to CloudVantage. I learned about it from a former colleague who'd moved to another company. "Daniel, you need to see this," he said, forwarding me a copy of the lawsuit. "Meridian's getting hammered. Plaintiffs are claiming gross negligence in vendor oversight." I read through the filing with growing alarm. The damages were staggering, not just from the breach itself, but from the lost business, regulatory fines, and reputation damage. The plaintiffs' attorneys had clearly done their homework, identifying every gap in Meridian's vendor management that had allowed the breach to occur. But the real gut punch came when I saw the expert witness list. They'd hired Marcus Hendricks, a vendor management consultant who'd been my professional rival for years. Marcus would testify that Meridian's contracts were inadequately structured and failed to meet industry standards for data protection. The key irony was suffocating. The same rigid contracts that Bradley had dismissed would have protected them from exactly this scenario. 2 days later, Henderson Tech announced they were terminating their contract with Meridian, effective immediately. Apparently, their new flexible partnership wasn't flexible enough to handle Henderson's decision to pivot to serving only enterprise clients. Meridian was left scrambling to find replacement services while their systems crashed daily. The stock price dropped 12% in a single trading session. I watched the news coverage with a mixture of professional fascination and personal anguish. These were people I'd worked with for decades, a company I'd helped protect and grow. Seeing it crumble because of preventable mistakes felt like watching a family member make devastating life choices. Sarah called me that evening. "Daniel, it's getting worse. The board's demanding answers and Bradley's throwing everyone under the bus. He's saying the contracts department failed to properly vet vendor relationships. He's blaming Jennifer. He's blaming everyone except himself. And Jennifer's talking about leaving. She says she was just following executive guidance to be more collaborative." I could hear the desperation in Sarah's voice. "What do you think happens next?" "More lawsuits. The Cloud Vantage breach was just the beginning. We've got vendor relationships falling apart across the board, and none of the new contracts have adequate protections." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the people who'd lose their jobs, the shareholders who'd lose their investments, the customers who'd lose their trust, all because someone thought expertise was the same as rigidity. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. I was making coffee when I saw Mark Stevens' name on my caller ID. Mark was senior legal counsel, the same guy who'd escorted me out of the building 3 months earlier, carrying my box of personal items like evidence from a crime scene. "Daniel, we need you back." His voice was shaking, barely controlled panic bleeding through his professional composure. The Hendricks lawsuit just escalated to 8 figures and nobody can find the termination clauses. I set down my coffee mug carefully. "What's the Hendricks lawsuit?" "Marcus Hendricks, the consultant who testified against us in the Cloud Vantage case. Turns out he's been working with our competitors to poach our vendor relationships. He's claiming we breached confidentiality agreements by sharing his consulting reports with third parties." "Did you?" "That's just it, we don't know. Jennifer restructured all the consultant agreements and the confidentiality terms are unclear. Hendricks says we violated his IP rights and he's demanding damages plus injunctive relief to stop us from using any of his recommendations." I sat down heavily. "How much are we talking about?" $83 million plus ongoing royalties for any business processes based on his work. "Daniel, his fingerprints are on half our vendor management strategies from the past 5 years. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. I'd worked with Marcus on several industry committees. He was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely capable of engineering this kind of legal trap." "Where's Bradley?" I asked. "That's the other problem. He's been unavailable for all the emergency board meetings. Word is he's talking to headhunters about new opportunities." Of course he was. The same executive who'd dismissed 25 years of expertise was now abandoning ship rather than face the consequences of his decisions. "Mark, I need to ask you something directly. Are you calling me as a friend, or is this an official request from the company?" The pause was long enough to confirm what I already suspected. "The board authorized me to explore all options for addressing our vendor contract crisis. Your name came up as someone with institutional knowledge." Institutional knowledge. I laughed bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "Daniel, we're in serious trouble here. The Cloud Vantage settlement alone could cost us $40 million. Add in the Henderson tech replacement costs, the Hendricks lawsuit, and the dozen other vendor disputes Jennifer's deals have created, and we're looking at potential bankruptcy." I walked to my window, looking out at the city where I'd spent my entire career. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Come back, consultant basis, temporary assignment. Help us understand what went wrong and how to fix it. And if I say no?" Another pause. "Then a lot of good people lose their jobs and 25 years of your work building this company gets destroyed by 3 months of bad decisions." He knew exactly which buttons to push. But I'd learned something important during my months of unemployment. Sometimes the best way to prove your value is to let people experience its absence. "I'll consider it," I said. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I want a written acknowledgement from the board that the vendor contract crisis resulted from abandoning established risk management practices. Second, I want full authority to review and modify any vendor agreement that's creating legal exposure. Third, I want Jennifer Walsh removed from any role involving contract negotiations." "Daniel, that's..." Non-negotiable, Mark. You called me because you need someone who's too rigid to clean up the mess created by someone who was flexible. Either you accept that reality, or you find someone else. I could hear him breathing, heavily on the other end of the line. I'll present your terms to the board. You do that. And Mark? Tell them I'll need Bradley's written apology as well. Not for my ego, for the record. When the shareholders start asking questions, I want it clear that this crisis was caused by ignoring professional expertise, not by following it. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about justice and vindication and the difference between being right and being helpful. I'd spent 3 months watching my former company destroy itself, and now they wanted me to save them from their own mistakes. The irony was perfect. The same rigid approach they'd rejected was now their only hope for survival. But first, they'd have to admit they were wrong. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 months of research I'd compiled while watching Meridian's vendor relationships implode. The same conference room where Bradley had dismissed my expertise now felt like a courtroom, where I was both prosecutor and potential savior. The board members filed in, looking like they'd aged years in just a few months. Patricia Coleman, the Hawaii board chair, took her seat at the head of the table. Mark Stevens sat to her right, shuffling papers nervously. Bradley's chair remained conspicuously empty. Daniel, Patricia began. Thank you for coming. I think we all owe you an apology. I'm not here for apologies, I replied, opening my portfolio. I'm here because good people are about to lose their jobs over preventable mistakes. I placed a bound document in front of each board member. This is a comprehensive analysis of every vendor contract modified or negotiated since my departure. I've identified 43 agreements that create significant legal exposure, including 12 that could result in 8-figure damages. Patricia flipped through the pages, her face growing paler. How did you compile this? Public filings, industry contacts, and institutional knowledge. The same rigid approach that apparently wasn't flexible enough for modern business. Board member James Walsh, no relation to Jennifer, leaned forward. What's the total exposure? Conservative estimate, $230 million in direct damages plus ongoing operational costs for replacement services. Worst-case scenario approaches $500 million when you factor in stock devaluation and brand damage. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning. However, I continued, most of these problems are still fixable. The key is acting, quickly and decisively. I walked to the whiteboard and began sketching out a timeline. First, we need to stop the bleeding. There are 6 contracts with immediate termination clauses that we can still trigger. That eliminates our exposure to vendors who are actively creating problems. Won't that be expensive? Asked board member Susan Kim. Less expensive than letting them continue to operate without proper oversight. The Henderson Tech replacement, for example, we're spending 40% more per month on emergency services than we would pay in early termination penalties. Patricia was taking notes furiously. What about the Hendricks lawsuit? Marcus is smart, but he's not invincible. The problem is that Jennifer's contracts are so poorly written that they create ambiguity about what constitutes proprietary information. We need to challenge his claims aggressively while simultaneously documenting that his recommendations were based on publicly available best practices. I turned back to the board. But here's the bigger issue. You have a systemic problem with contract management. Jennifer Walsh isn't just incompetent, she's actively dangerous. Every day she remains in her position, she creates more liability. James Walsh shifted uncomfortably. She's been following executive guidance to be more collaborative with vendors. Collaborative doesn't mean suicidal, I shot back. A good contract protects both parties and creates a framework for success. Jennifer's contracts protect no one and guarantee failure. I pulled out my phone and showed them a screenshot of a recent industry article. CloudVantage is about to file for bankruptcy. Their business model was based on selling inadequate services to companies with poorly written contracts. Guess which company is their biggest customer? The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. So, what do you want from us? Patricia asked. Complete authority to fix this mess. I want Jennifer Walsh terminated immediately. I want all pending contract negotiations suspended until I can review them. And I want a board resolution acknowledging that this crisis resulted from abandoning established risk management practices. That's a significant admission of liability, Mark warned. The liability already exists, I replied. The question is whether you want to manage it proactively or let it destroy the company. Patricia looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. All in favor of accepting Daniel's terms? The vote was unanimous. Welcome. Back, she said. How soon can you start? I was already standing up, gathering my papers. I started 3 months ago. I'll have a preliminary action plan to you by tomorrow morning. As I walked out of the conference room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being absolutely undeniably right. 6 months later, I was sitting in my old office, the same one Bradley had redecorated with modern furniture and artificial plants. I'd had it restored to its original configuration, filing cabinets organized by risk level, a master spreadsheet tracking every renewal date, and a coffee mug that read, "Rigidly protecting your assets since 1999. The Hendricks lawsuit had been settled for $12 million, a significant sum, but far less than the $83 million he'd originally demanded. Our lawyers had successfully argued that his recommendations constituted industry best practices rather than proprietary innovations. More importantly, we'd countersued for consulting fraud and recovered most of our losses. The CloudVantage bankruptcy had actually worked in our favor. When they filed for Chapter 11, we'd been able to negotiate a priority claim for the data, breach damages. We'd recover about 60 cents on the dollar, which was better than the 0 cents we would have gotten under Jennifer's original contract. Henderson Tech had come crawling back within a month, offering to restore services at a 20% discount. I'd negotiated a new contract with ironclad performance guarantees and penalty clauses. They'd complained about the terms being adversarial, but they'd signed anyway. Funny how vendors appreciate clear expectations when they're properly motivated. Jennifer Walsh had landed at a smaller company where she could continue her experiments in collaborative contracting. I'd heard through industry contacts that she'd already created 2 significant vendor disputes in her first quarter. Some people never learn. Bradley Kowalski had taken a position as Chief Innovation Officer at a tech startup in Austin. His LinkedIn profile described him as a transformational leader who drives organizational change through strategic vendor partnerships. I'd blocked him on all social media platforms, but sometimes I still saw his posts when colleagues shared them ironically. The real vindication came from an unexpected source. Harvard Business Review had published a case study about Meridian's vendor crisis and recovery, using it as an example of what happens when companies abandon proven risk management practices. They'd interviewed me extensively, and the article had been shared thousands of times with the hashtag #RigidityWorks. My favorite quote from the article: "The most expensive flexibility is the kind that breaks under pressure." Sarah Chen knocked on my door, carrying a stack of contracts for review. She'd been promoted to senior contracts analyst after Jennifer's departure, and she'd proven to be a quick study in the art of protective negotiations. "Daniel, the Meridian Times wants to do a feature story about your return. Should I schedule an interview?" I looked up from the contract I was reviewing, a vendor agreement for our new coffee service, complete with quality guarantees and early termination clauses. Even the small vendors got the full treatment now. "No interviews," I said, "but you can tell them this. After 25 years in this business, I've learned that being called too rigid is usually a compliment. It means you're the only one taking the risk seriously." She smiled and headed back to her desk. I returned to my contract review, making notes about liability limits and termination procedures. The work was exactly the same as it had been 3 months ago, but somehow it felt different. Maybe it was the knowledge that my expertise had been tested in the most public way possible and had emerged victorious. Or maybe it was simply the satisfaction of proving that experience isn't the same as inflexibility. It's the wisdom to know when not to bend. The phone rang and I saw Mark Stevens' name on the caller ID. Probably another vendor crisis that needed fixing. I answered on the second ring. Daniel, we need to talk about the Morrison Industries contract. They're asking for some unusual terms. I smiled and reached for my red pen. How unusual are we talking? Some things never change, and in the contracts business, that's exactly how it should be.